This is the second case in our exhibition, More Than Robert Franks, The Americans, American Photography in 1960. And in this case, Diverse Practices, American Photography at Mid-Century, we look at an array of literature types to try to get some sense of how this sort of notion of diverse practices was in fact manifested in the field of photography as a field of cultural production. Of course, no exhibition on American photography in the 1950s or 1960s would be complete without a discussion of the family of man, the exhibition curated by Edward Steichen from the Museum of Modern Art, perhaps the most widely viewed exhibition of photography of all time. Apparently some 90 million plus people saw this exhibition as it traveled internationally. Included 503 photographs by 257 photographers from 68 countries. And included the work of Robert Frank. Now, one of the problems with Steichen's Family of Man exhibition, at least according to the photographers who were included, is that many of them felt that their photographs had been decontextualized and then recontextualized by Edward Steichen to fit within the sort of overarching sentimentalizing exhibition of the Family of Man, which really sort of posited this notion of a family of man. We are all together, we are all part of this one great humanity. And the exhibition and the book itself are broken up into sections which support that exhibition notion. So there are sections on food and sustenance, which is where Frank's Americans photographs fits in. It's followed by, this page is actually followed by a nice spread of a photograph by Robert Capa of a family in Russia eating. But as you may recall from the text we looked at in the first exhibition case from the 1958 photo annual, where Frank's work was first presented, the Americans' work was first presented, where Walker Evans stated, speaking of Robert Frank's photographs, "This bracing, almost stinging manner is seldom seen in a sustained collection of photographs." And then Evans goes on to make what might be seen as a direct sort of barb at Steichen and the Family of Man. Quote, "It is a far cry from all the woolly, successful photo sentiments about human familyhood, from the mindless pictorial sales talk around fashionable, guilty, and therefore bogus heart feeling." There was a sense by the photographers who were included in Family of Man that Steichen's overall project included this notion of a sort of bogus heart feeling. Still, it was an amazing exhibition. Of course, the photo annuals were indeed important as a means to both display photographs and therefore to sort of disseminate notions of photographic practice around the United States and the world for that matter. This is the second of the 5 photo annuals that we have in this exhibition. And within the pages of the camera annuals, you would see these very sort of interesting juxtapositions. For example, on this side, we have an abstract photograph of a tree stump by Paul Campernegro against this photograph on this side of a photograph by Bill Brandt. And of course, the fabulous thing about the camera annuals was the technical section, which was in the back, which allowed photographers to share their secrets, and especially important for the amateur and commercial photographers who wanted to work within, sort of follow the footsteps of the masters. So for example, we would see that Paul Campernegro's photograph was made with a 4x5 graphic view camera with an 8¼ Gorch Duggar lens, exposed for 1¼ seconds at f32 on Isopan Anscode film with the D23 development. The print was made on Kodak Medalist, developed in Dr. Beer's formula. And then it goes on for the Brandt portrait of Picasso. He used a Rolleiflex exposing 1/25 at f6.3 for Tri-X with microfilm development, and so on and so on. So the annuals were a hugely important means for knowledge about photographs and photographic styles and practices to be disseminated. One of the more interesting moments for 1960 photography would have been this exhibition, Photography at Mid-Century, the 10th anniversary exhibition for the George Eastman House, curated by Beaumont Newhall. And in the essay for the exhibition, Newhall talks about what he sees as 4 basic stylistic trends which were occurring in photography internationally, of course, in the United States as well. One was the straight approach, first explored by Alfred Stieglitz, Paul Strand, Ed Weston, Ansel Adams, and others. The second was the experimental. It's a reference to the work of Man Ray and Moholy-Nagy. The third would be photojournalistic, as practiced by Henry Cartier-Bresson and so on. He actually makes a reference to the decisive moment. And then the fourth is the development of the theory of the equivalent, as first explored by Alfred Stieglitz. And we'll see this notion of the equivalent later in the magazine Aperture, as edited by Minor White. And if you look at the first few photographs that appear within the exhibition catalog, you can clearly see that this straight approach, in which the ability of the camera to record exact images with rich texture and great detail is used to interpret nature and man, never losing contact with the reality. The approach is classical, and the fine print is presented as an experience in itself. And the first photographs shown follow this notion of this particular stylistic trend. The first is an Ansel Adams landscape. The second is a portrait by Arnold Newman. The third is actually the notion of the photograph as equivalent, Minor White. And then we go back to this original notion of photography, the portrait by Imogene Cunningham. And then finally, Nature Close-Up by Paul Strand. So clearly we can see that Newhall is prioritizing this notion of the straight approach. Another interesting thing is that he closes the essay by saying, of these 4 trends, one characteristic they have in common, which marks photography at mid-century, apart from photography during the 4 preceding decades, emulation of the painter has ceased to be an overwhelming preoccupation for the majority of photographers. Today, photography is almost unanimously accepted as a medium in its own right, with its own characteristics, limitations, and potentials. And even though Newhall is celebrating this distancing, this critical distancing of photography from the other arts, especially painting, there were still, at this same time, moments when comparisons to painting were still being made. So for example, also 1960, this is an issue of an important journal called Contemporary Photographer, a relatively short-lived life, 1960 to 1967. And in this issue, it actually served as an exhibition catalog for a show that was at the Museum of Modern Art called The Sense of Abstraction. And it included photographs that were, you would see photographs like this, for example, in the camera annuals. They're abstract. Bear in mind that this is the same time as the abstract expressionist movement was in full sway. For example, here's a triptych of work by a photographer named Jaromir Stefani, clearly abstract photography. The interesting thing, though, is that the essay is by Herbert Reed, the noted art historian, and it's a reprint of his In Defense of Abstract Art. So even though we have Newhall saying that one of the most important things is that photography has moved away from painting, when we get to the actual discussion and criticism of photography, we find that publishers and editors are still using texts that have to do with the larger sense of abstract art or with painting. So clearly the links between photography and painting were still quite strong and manifested in the sort of selection of these critical texts. Finally, the last thing we want to look at from this case is an issue of Aperture magazine, which was first started being published in 1952. It's still being published today. Very important photojournal. Minor White was the editor at this point in time. This is a 1959 issue, and we see a Minor White photograph on the cover. It's important because this notion of the equivalent photograph, which was a photographic practice that was very strong, followed by a number of photographers throughout the late 50s and 60s, continues today to a certain extent. And we would have seen photographs like that certainly in the Newhall 1960 Eastman House catalog and also in the camera annuals, probably not in the Family of Man. Minor White, this issue was sort of titled The Way Through Camera Work and included right off the bat, after the photograph, which is an abstract photograph, this representation of the Chinese character Qi. And there's a quote by Alfred Stieglitz. In all of camera work, the only freshness is spirit, and spirit is the only quality in art that forever eludes imitation. I think this is important because it helps to reveal that for Minor White, photography was a means for self-discovery and self-growth. Photography was about the journey as much as it was about the print. Throughout the pages of Aperture, we would see these Zen aphorisms. Here's another one by Minor White himself. Once it has selected a photographer, spirit always stands still long enough to be recorded. Spirit and movement are never imitated, but perpetually discovered. And I wanted to show you this issue of Aperture because it includes a portrait of the young Mark Adams. Now, Mark Adams was a young artist living in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time, which is, Minor White was also in the San Francisco Bay Area for a number of years. And Stanford University holds the Mark Adams Archive. Mark Adams was a noted individual in the sort of rediscovery and redevelopment of the American tapestry movement. The Mark Adams Archive, which we have here at Stanford, includes a number of these Mark Adams portraits, including a small maquette for a sequence that White did of Mark Adams. So before we move to the next case, where we're going to look at the development of the American photo book around 1959, 1960, 1961, in closing, I just want to say that this exhibition, once again, sort of brings the literature forward as a means to investigate the culture and to establish this notion of diverse practices. Because it was in the pages of publications like these that these various practices were sort of first put forward, were defended, were articulated, were pushed against, and so on. So now we'll look at case 3 and some photo books in the exhibition.